The sound of an electric saw cut through the morning silence in Rosewood as Frank Parker cut boards for a wedding arch in his backyard. 54 years of life had left deep wrinkles on his face, and the gray in his hair spoke more than words ever could. His hands, accustomed to weapons since his service in Iraq, now deftly handled carpentry tools. "Frank, breakfast is ready," Dorothy called from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron embroidered with roses. At 51, she had retained the neatness and decency that had once attracted the young soldier. Every morning began with prayer, and every evening ended with reading the Bible. Frank turned off the saw and looked at his work. The arch was turning out exactly as he had imagined it. Strong, reliable, capable of withstanding any storm. Just like the family he had built. Just like the values he had passed on to his son. "Is Jake up yet?" he asked as he entered the house and washed his hands in the sink. "He's still asleep. He stayed up late with Emily last night, discussing the details of the ceremony," Dorothy replied, placing a plate of eggs and bacon on the table. "You know, I'm so glad he finally found a good girl. Emily is so modest and well-mannered." Frank nodded as he sat down at the table. A flash of pride crossed his eyes. Jacob had always been a special child, smart, sensitive, not like the other boys in the neighborhood. Frank had sometimes worried that his son was too soft for this world, but now that Jacob was getting married, everything seemed to fall into place. "Remember how he used to say he'd never get married?" Frank smiled. "And now look at him, a teacher, a respected man in the town, a beautiful bride. We can be proud of what we've raised." Dorothy smiled, but a shadow of worry flashed across her eyes. A mother's heart felt what her mind refused to accept. Too often she had noticed Jacob avert his gaze when the conversation turned to his future with Emily. Too often he seemed distracted, as if his thoughts were far away. At 7:30 in the morning, Jacob came down to the kitchen. 28 years old, tall and slender, with soft features and intelligent eyes behind his glasses. As a child, Frank had dreamed that his son would follow in his footsteps, perhaps join the army, then take over the family business. But Jacob had chosen teaching, and Frank had accepted that. The main thing was that his son had turned out to be a decent person. "Good morning, Dad, Mom," Jacob said, kissing his mother on the cheek. His voice sounded tired, as if he hadn't slept well. "How are the preparations going? Everything under control?" Frank asked, studying his son's face. "Yes, everything is going according to plan. Emily took care of most of the organizing. She's very responsible," Jacob replied, pouring himself some coffee. "She's a good woman. She'll make you a faithful wife and give you healthy grandchildren," Frank said with satisfaction. "By the way, the arch is almost ready. Want to take a look?" Jacob nodded, though there was no enthusiasm in his eyes. They went out into the yard, where Frank proudly showed off his work. The arch was indeed beautiful, massive, decorated with carvings that Frank had done in the evenings. "You see, son, marriage isn't just a ceremony. It's a commitment to God, to your family, to society," Frank said, running his hand over the smooth wood. "A man must be the head of the family, the protector, the provider, and a woman is the keeper of the hearth. That's how it's been since the beginning of time." Jacob listened silently, clutching his coffee mug. He had heard these words hundreds of times since childhood. Frank wasn't a cruel father, but his ideas about the right way to live were as unshakable as a rock. "I always knew you would choose the right path," Frank continued. "Some young people today stray from the path, fall under the influence of all kinds of fads. But you're my son. You have the right values." At that moment, Jacob's phone rang. He glanced quickly at the screen and rejected the call. "Who was that?" Frank asked. "No one important. Probably just advertising," Jacob replied, putting his phone in his pocket. Frank didn't notice his son's hands tremble or see that the name on the screen was Mark. He continued talking about his wedding plans and how important it was to make the day perfect. "You know, I'm thinking of inviting the guys from the regiment, the ones who still live in town. I want them to see that my son has become a real man," Frank said, straightening his shoulders proudly. After breakfast, Jacob left for school, and Frank headed to his gun shop, Parker and Sons, located in downtown Rosewood. He had opened the shop after being discharged from the army, investing his injury compensation and all his savings in it. Business was good. The town loved hunting, and many people kept guns for self-defense. The first customer was Tom Miller, the local sheriff and an old friend of Frank's. They had served together, gone through the hell of the Iraq War, and their bond was stronger than any family ties. "How are the wedding preparations going?" Tom asked, examining the new rifle. "Everything's great. Jake found a nice girl. Emily works as a nurse at the hospital and comes from a decent family. They're getting married at St. Paul's Church," Frank said proudly. "I remember when he was a kid, he was more interested in books than girls." Tom smiled. "You were worried back then." Frank frowned. Yes, he had been worried. Jacob had grown up a quiet, thoughtful child. He didn't fight with other boys or chase girls, preferring to read or listen to music. Frank tried to instill masculine interests in his son. He taught him how to shoot, took him fishing, and enrolled him in sports. But Jacob remained himself, gentle, sensitive, unlike other boys. "All children are different," Frank said. "The main thing is that he grew up to be a decent person. Now he's getting married and having children. Everything is as it should be." "Of course, Frank. That's not what I meant," Tom replied quickly, realizing he had touched on a sore subject. In the evening, the Parker family gathered for dinner. Dorothy had prepared her son's favorite dish, baked chicken with potatoes. Jacob seemed distracted, frequently glancing at his phone. "Tell us about your day at school," his mother asked. "The usual. I'm helping the seniors prepare for their exams and grading essays," Jacob replied mechanically. "When is Emily coming home?" "I wanted to discuss the flowers for the church with her," Dorothy continued. "She's working the night shift. She'll be home tomorrow," Jacob said, not looking up from his plate. Frank watched his son closely. Something was wrong. Jacob looked troubled, as if something was bothering him. Maybe it was pre-wedding jitters? That was normal for a groom. "Son, if something's bothering you, you can talk to me," Frank said. "I understand that marriage is a big step. It's a big responsibility." Jacob looked up. For a moment it seemed like he wanted to say something, but then his face closed again. "Everything's fine, Dad. I'm just tired." After dinner, Jacob went up to his room. Frank and Dorothy stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes and discussing the final preparations. "I think something's wrong with Jacob," Dorothy said quietly. "He's been so distant lately." "Pre-wedding jitters," Frank replied, but he wasn't entirely sure. "It's normal. Every man gets nervous before he gets married." But Dorothy's mother's heart felt more than she wanted to admit. She had noticed too many strange things in her son's behavior. He avoided talking about the future with Emily too often, and this girl was so understanding, so patient. It was as if she was playing a role rather than experiencing real feelings. Meanwhile, in his room, Jacob sat on his bed holding his phone. There were several unread messages from Mark on the screen. Each one hurt, reminding him of the lies he was telling, the game he was playing. It was getting dark outside. There were less than 3 weeks left until the wedding, and with each passing day, it became more difficult to maintain the facade he had worn his entire life. The next day, Jacob met Emily at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, where they were unlikely to be seen by anyone they knew. Emily Cole was an attractive 26-year-old girl with chestnut hair and kind eyes. In her white nurse's uniform, she looked the epitome of femininity and caring. But now, in jeans and a simple blouse, she looked like an ordinary girl carrying a heavy burden of secrets. "You look terrible," she said, sitting down across from Jacob at a table by the window. "Thanks for the support," he said with a bitter smile, stirring his cold coffee. "Mark wrote again. He doesn't understand why I need this." Emily sighed. Their friendship had begun 2 years ago in the hospital when Jacob was admitted after an accident. Emily was the nurse on duty, and they struck up a conversation about books. It turned out they had a lot in common. Both felt like strangers in this city. Both hid their true nature from those around them. "Jake, we can call it off," she said quietly. "It's not too late. Let's just say we realized we're not right for each other." "No," Jacob shook his head firmly. "I can't disappoint my father. You don't know him, Emily. Family values are sacred to him. If he finds out the truth..." He didn't finish, but Emily understood. Over the months they had known each other, she had heard a lot about Frank Parker. A war veteran and deeply religious man, He found any deviation from traditional norms unacceptable. Jacob had told her how his father reacted to the news of the legalization of same-sex marriage and how he spoke about gays and lesbians. "What about me?" Emily asked. "I'm deceiving my family too. My parents are so happy that I'm finally getting married. My mother is already planning grandchildren." "We'll be fine," Jacob said, but his voice sounded uncertain. "Many people live in marriages of convenience. We're friends, we support each other. That's more than many couples have." Emily knew that Jacob was trying to convince not only her, but himself. She understood his motives, but deep down, she doubted that such a lie could bring happiness to either of them. "Tell me about Mark," she asked. "I know he means more to you than just a friend." Jacob looked away. Mark Dennis worked as a programmer in a neighboring town, and they had met 3 years ago at a teachers' conference. Mark was openly gay and lived honestly, without hiding his orientation. For Jacob, he was a breath of fresh air in a world of lies and pretense. "We've been seeing each other secretly," Jacob began, his voice warming. "Mark rents an apartment in Madison, an hour away. I told my parents I was taking a professional development course. We spent the weekends together." Memories flooded back to him. Mark cooked dinner while Jacob checked his students' notebooks. They watched movies and walked in parks where no one knew them. For the first time in his life, Jacob felt like himself, not playing the role of the perfect son. "He wanted me to move in with him," Jacob continued. "He said we could live openly, that we didn't have to hide. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave my parents. I couldn't destroy their world." "And that's why you decided to marry me," Emily stated. "It seemed like the best way out. My parents would be happy, society wouldn't ask questions, and we could live peacefully, covering for each other." Emily understood Jacob's logic, but her heart ached. She too was hiding her true nature, but unlike Jacob, she didn't have Mark. Her secret was different. She simply couldn't fall in love with men, felt no attraction to them. In a conservative family, this was no less shameful than homosexuality. "Does Mark know about our engagement?" she asked. "Yes, he doesn't understand. He's angry with me. He says I'm ruining my life and yours too." "Maybe he's right." Jacob raised his head sharply. "Emily, if you want to back out..." "Oh, no," she shook her head. "I don't want to back out. I just think we both deserve honesty, at least with each other." They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. People passed by outside the window, and Jacob envied their seemingly simple lives. None of them knew what it was like to live in constant fear of exposure, what it was like to wear a mask every day. "My mother suspects something," he finally said. "She was looking at me strangely yesterday. She asked questions about our relationship." "Dorothy is a smart woman. A mother's heart feels more than she wants to," Emily replied. "What about your father?" "My father sees what he wants to see. To him, I'm the perfect son who is finally growing up and starting a family. He's so proud of me." Jacob's voice faltered. Emily reached out and covered his hand. "Jake, you're a good man. Don't blame yourself for trying to protect the people you love. But I hurt other people. Mark, you, myself. Where's the protection in that?" They agreed to meet the next day with Emily's parents to discuss the details of the ceremony. The Cole family lived in another part of town, and Frank and Dorothy were coming over for dinner. That evening, Jacob came home to find his father in the garage cleaning his hunting rifle. Frank always found comfort in working with guns. It reminded him of a time when everything was clear and understandable, when he knew who his enemies were and who his friends were. "Dad, can we talk?" Jacob asked. "Sure, son, have a seat," Frank said, pointing to an old chair. "What's on your mind?" Jacob sat down, gathering his thoughts. Part of him wanted to tell the truth, to end this game. But looking at his father, at his tired face, at his hands trembling with memories of the war, he couldn't find the words. "I'm thinking about the future," he began cautiously. "About what kind of husband I'll be, what our children will be like." Frank smiled. "You'll be a great husband. I have no doubt about that. You're well-mannered, responsible, kind. Emily is lucky to have you. What if I don't live up to your expectations? What if I don't become the kind of father you were?" Frank put down the rifle and looked at his son seriously. Jacob, you're my son. Your blood runs through my veins and mine runs through yours. We Parker men have always known right from wrong. It's been passed down from generation to generation. But times are changing, Dad. What was right for your generation may not be right for mine. Frank's face darkened. Some things don't change, son. Family, faith, honor are eternal values. There's a lot of talk these days about tolerance, about accepting all kinds of perversions, but a man must remain a man, and a woman must remain a woman. That's the law of nature. Jacob felt his heart tighten. What if someone can't live up to those expectations? Then he's not my son, Frank replied harshly. I didn't raise weaklings and perverts. I raised a real man. His father's words hit him like a slap in the face. Jacob realized he would never be able to tell him the truth. The price was too high. You're right, Dad, he said quietly. Sorry for asking stupid questions. Don't apologize. It's normal to be nervous. Marriage is a big step, but I know you'll do fine. You'll make me a proud grandfather. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep for a long time. He lay in the dark, listening to his parents getting ready for bed in the next room. His mother was talking to his father about the wedding dress, the flowers, how happy she was. Their voices sounded so peaceful, so calm. He took out his phone and reread Mark's messages. The last one had been sent an hour ago. I miss you. Please think about it again. We can be happy. Jacob closed his eyes. Happiness seemed like an unattainable luxury to him. He wasn't born in the right place, at the right time, or into the right family. His fate had been sealed from the moment he was born. He started to type a reply. I miss you too, but I can't. Then he deleted the message and put his phone under his pillow. It was starting to get light outside. Another day of lies was beginning in the Parker household. Another day when Jacob had to play the role of the perfect son, the loving fiancé, the future father of a family. Somewhere in another city, Mark was also awake, waiting for a reply that would never come. And in the next room, Dorothy lay with her eyes open, feeling her world falling apart, though she didn't understand why. Saturday, the day before the wedding, the Parker family home was buzzing like a beehive. Relatives had arrived from other cities, neighbors were helping Dorothy with the last-minute preparations, and Frank had been setting up tables in the yard since morning. Jacob was supposed to help his father, but in the morning he claimed to have a headache and locked himself in his room. Jacob, are you alive in there? Dorothy knocked on the door. Emily arrived an hour ago. She's worried. I'll be right out, Mom, he replied in a hoarse voice. In fact, Jacob was sitting on the floor near his bed, holding his phone in his hands. Mark had been calling all week, but Jacob hadn't dared to answer. This morning, the last message came. If you don't call back by noon, I'll come over. We need to talk. Jacob looked at the clock. It was 11 in the morning. He dialed Mark's number, his hands shaking. Finally, he heard the familiar voice. Jake, what's going on with you? You disappeared for a whole week. I'm sorry, Mark. It's crazy at home. The wedding is tomorrow. Tomorrow you're going to make the biggest mistake of your life, Mark interrupted him, and ruin a good girl's life. Don't say that. Emily agreed. She understands. No one can understand such a lie, Jake. You think you're protecting everyone, but you're actually hurting everyone. Jacob closed his eyes. I can't disappoint my parents. You don't understand what it's like to live in their world. Then change their world. Show them that love doesn't depend on gender. You're a smart, educated man. You're a teacher. Mark, please don't make this difficult. After the wedding, we can still see each other sometimes, like before. Like before? Mark's voice grew cold. You want me to be your mistress? To wait for you while you play the happy husband? No, that's not what I meant. That's exactly what you meant. You know what, Jake? I thought you were stronger. I thought you were capable of honesty, but you're a coward. The connection was cut. Jacob stared at the phone screen, feeling something inside him break. Mark was right. He really was a coward. He heard voices and laughter downstairs. Jacob stood up and looked at himself in the mirror. A pale face, dull eyes, disheveled hair. No one should see him like this. Meanwhile, in the yard, Frank was supervising the setting up of the last table. His brother Dave had arrived from the neighboring state with his family, and Frank was enjoying his role as the head of a large family celebration. "Remember how we used to dream about grandchildren?" Dave said, helping to arrange the chairs. "Now your Jacob is getting married. Time flies." "Yes, he found a good girl. Emily is a sweetheart, hard-working, from a decent family. The grandchildren will be beautiful," Frank replied proudly. "Where's the groom? I don't see him anywhere." "He's getting ready. He's probably nervous. That's normal before such an important day." But when noon turned to dinner and Jacob still hadn't come downstairs, Frank began to worry. Emily was sitting in the living room with Dorothy and her aunts, but she was clearly nervous too. "I'll go check on the boy," Frank said and headed for the stairs. He knocked on his son's door. "Jacob, open up. We need to talk." "Just a minute, Dad." Frank heard a rustling sound, the sound of a laptop being closed, footsteps. The door opened, and his son appeared in the doorway, pale and with red eyes. "What's wrong with you? You look sick." Frank frowned. "I'm just worried. I didn't sleep well." "I understand, but we have guests downstairs. Emily is waiting. You need to be a host." "Yes, of course. I'll just tidy myself up." Frank wanted to leave, but something held him back. There was a strange smell in the air, not illness or fatigue, but some kind of fear. He looked around his son's room with the eye of an experienced soldier. A closed laptop lay on the table, next to a stack of notebooks waiting to be graded. Everything seemed normal, but, "Jacob, if something's bothering you, tell me, man to man." His son looked away. "Everything's fine, Dad. I'm just nervous." "Okay, I'll see you downstairs in half an hour, and clean yourself up. You look like a ghost." Frank left, but the strange feeling wouldn't leave him. Something about his son's behavior was alarming. He went downstairs, but his thoughts kept returning to Jacob. In the evening, when the guests had left, and Emily had gone home to prepare for the next day, the Parker family was left alone. Dorothy was cleaning the kitchen, Frank was checking the final preparations, and Jacob had locked himself in his room again. "He's been acting strange," Dorothy said to her husband when they were alone. "He's been out of sorts all day." "Pre-wedding jitters," Frank replied, but he was uneasy himself. "Should we go check on him again?" "No, let him be. Let him be alone. Gather his thoughts." Around midnight, Frank went upstairs to bed. Passing his son's room, he heard soft sounds, as if someone were talking on the phone. He listened. Jacob was indeed talking to someone, but the voice was so quiet that it was impossible to make out the words. Frank wanted to knock, but changed his mind. Maybe his son was talking to Emily, calming her down before an important day. That would be normal. But Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening to his wife breathing quietly beside him, thinking about his son. Something was wrong. He could feel it with every fiber of his being. His fatherly instinct, honed by years of military service, was screaming that danger was approaching. At 3 a.m, he got up and quietly went down to the kitchen to get a drink of water. Passing the stairs, he saw a strip of light under Jacob's door. His son was still awake. Frank went upstairs and carefully pressed his ear against the door. It was quiet inside, but he could hear quiet sobs. His son was crying. "Jacob?" he called softly. The sound stopped immediately. "What is it, Dad?" "Are you crying?" "No, just allergies. My nose is stuffy." Frank knew his son was lying. "Open the door, let's talk." "Dad, it's late. Tomorrow is an important day. We need to get some sleep." "I can't sleep until I know what's going on with you." A long pause. Then the door opened. Jacob stood there in his pajamas, his eyes red but not from allergies. "Son, what's wrong? Are you afraid of getting married?" Jacob looked at his father, and Frank saw such pain in his eyes that his heart ached. "Dad, what if I'm not what you want me to be?" "What are you talking about? What if I disappoint you? What if I can't be the kind of husband and father you were?" Frank entered the room and sat down on the edge of the bed. "Jacob, you're my son. You can't disappoint me. I'm proud of you. You're educated, kind, and decent. But what if that's not enough? What if there are things you can't accept?" "Like what?" Jacob was silent, struggling with himself. Part of him wanted to tell him everything. to end this torture, but looking at his father's tired face, he couldn't bring himself to say the words that would destroy his world. "Nothing, Dad. Just nerves." Frank put his arm around his son's shoulders. "Listen to me carefully. Tomorrow you're marrying a good girl. You'll have a long, happy life, children, grandchildren. You'll carry on our family name, our traditions. That's the most important thing a man can do." "What if I can't?" "You can. Because you're a real man. Because I raised you to be one." After his father left, Jacob sat down at his laptop again. His hands trembled as he opened his email and began typing a letter to Mark. He wrote and deleted, unable to find the words. Finally, he simply wrote, "I'm sorry." Meanwhile, Frank lay in bed, unable to sleep. The conversation with his son had not calmed him down, but rather increased his anxiety. Something about Jacob's behavior was wrong, unnatural. It was as if he was playing a role rather than experiencing real emotions. At 5 in the morning, Frank got up and decided to check the final preparations in the yard. He went downstairs, stepped outside, and walked around the tables, checking that everything was in place. The wedding arch he had made himself looked beautiful in the pre-dawn light. Returning to the house, he noticed that the light was still on in his son's room. Could Jacob still be awake? Frank went upstairs and quietly pushed the door open. It wasn't locked. Jacob was sitting at his desk with his back to the door, hunched over his laptop. He was so absorbed in what he was doing that he didn't hear his father's footsteps. Frank took a step forward and involuntarily glanced at the computer screen. What he saw made his blood run cold. The screen displayed a social media conversation. Jacob was writing to someone named Mark, but these weren't ordinary friendly messages. Frank read a few lines and understood the whole truth. "I miss our weekends together. You were right. I shouldn't marry Emily. I'm sorry I hurt you, but I love you." Frank stood there stunned. His son, his only son, whom he was so proud of. He couldn't wrap his head around it. Jacob was gay. The wedding to Emily was a lie. All these years, his son had been lying to him, pretending. Jacob sensed someone behind him and turned around. When he saw his father, he turned pale and quickly closed his laptop, but it was too late. "Dad, I can explain." "Explain what?" Frank's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "That you're a pervert? That you've been lying to me your whole life? That you're going to deceive a nice girl tomorrow? Dad, please listen to me." "Listen?" Frank took a step forward, and Jacob involuntarily recoiled. "Listen to how my son, whom I raised to be a real man, turned out to be." He couldn't say a word. For Frank Parker, a war veteran and religious conservative, it was worse than death. "I'm still your son," Jacob said quietly. "I haven't changed. I'm the same person you loved." "No," Frank shook his head. "My son is dead. I don't know who you are." He turned and left the room, leaving Jacob alone. He went down to his study, sat down in his chair, and covered his face with his hands. His mind was blank, filled only with the white noise of rage and despair. All these years he had been proud of his son, telling his friends about his achievements, dreaming of grandchildren. And it turned out that it was all a lie. His son was the very pervert he spoke of with contempt. Frank stood up and walked over to the safe where he kept his weapons. He opened it and took out a pistol. The cold metal in his hand had a calming effect. In the army, everything was simple. There was an enemy, there was a target, there was a solution. But what do you do when the enemy is your own son? Upstairs, Jacob sat on his bed, realizing that his life had just been destroyed. His father knew the truth. The wedding was supposed to take place tomorrow, but now everything had changed. He took out his phone and dialed Emily's number. "We need to talk. Urgently." Dawn was breaking outside. The wedding day was approaching, but no one in the Parker house believed that it would bring happiness. Sunday morning in Rosewood began with the ringing of the bells of St. Paul's Church. It was 7 in the morning, and the Parker house was already bustling with last-minute preparations. Dorothy was busy in the kitchen, making breakfast for the relatives who had stayed overnight, but her mind was far away. Last night she had noticed that her husband was acting strangely, silent, tense, avoiding her gaze. "Frank, would you like some coffee?" she called into the living room, where he sat in his armchair, staring at a single point. "No, thank you," he replied hoarsely, without turning his head. Dorothy frowned. In 30 years of marriage, she had learned to read her husband's moods, and now something was seriously wrong. He looked as if he hadn't slept all night, and there was a vacant look in his eyes that she had only seen after he returned from Iraq. Upstairs in his room, Jacob sat on the edge of his bed in his boxers, staring at his wedding suit hanging on a hanger. The dark blue jacket, white shirt, and silver tie had all been chosen with love and care. Now the suit seemed like a funeral suit to him. Late last night, he had met Emily at a 24-hour cafe. He told her about his conversation with his father, about how he had found out everything. Emily turned pale, but remained steadfast. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I don't know. My father looked at me as if I were a monster. He said his son was dead. Maybe we should call off the wedding. Tell people we've changed our minds." Jacob shook his head. "It's too late. Everything's been arranged, the guests have arrived, and besides, I don't know what my father is capable of in this state." Now, sitting in his room, he realized he had made the wrong decision. He should have called it off yesterday. But his fear of his father, of scandal, of disgrace, was stronger than common sense. At 8 in the morning, Emily's relatives began to arrive. Her mother, Mrs. Cole, bustled about with bouquets of flowers, while her father checked the camera. He was going to film the ceremony. Emily's younger sister, Sarah, was the maid of honor, and kept asking where the groom was. "Jacob is getting ready," Dorothy replied, although she was starting to get nervous herself. Her son still hadn't come down for breakfast. Frank went up to his bedroom and started getting dressed. He put on his best suit, the one he had worn when he got married. In the mirror, a tired man with dead eyes stared back at him. He combed his hair, adjusted his tie, and looked at his reflection again. Then he opened the bedside table and took out a Glock 19 pistol, the same one he had served with in Iraq. He checked the magazine and cocked the hammer. The sound of metal against metal had a calming effect on him, taking him back to a time when everything was clear and understandable. He tucked the gun into his waistband under his jacket and went downstairs. By 10 o'clock, the house was filled with guests. Frank's colleagues from the army, neighbors, family friends, and Jacob's classmates had all arrived. Everyone congratulated Frank on his son and told him what a happy father he was. He nodded, thanked them, and smiled. But inside he felt like a frozen void. Tom Miller, the sheriff, and an old friend approached him with a glass of beer. "So happy, Dad? Looking forward to grandchildren?" "Yeah," Frank replied curtly. "I am. Jake's a good kid. He'll make a great family man." Frank looked at his friend for a long time. "You know, Tom, sometimes people turn out to be completely different from what we thought they were." Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" "Nothing. Just thinking out loud." At 10:30, Jacob finally came downstairs, dressed in his wedding suit. He looked terrible, pale, with dark circles under his eyes, his hands shaking. The guests immediately surrounded him with congratulations, but he barely responded, nodding mechanically. Dorothy went over to her son and hugged him. "Honey, you look sick. Maybe we should postpone the ceremony?" "No, Mom, I'm fine. I'm just nervous." But Dorothy could see it wasn't nerves. Her son looked like he was going to his execution. Frank stood in the corner of the living room watching his son. Jacob avoided his gaze, staying as far away from his father as possible. Good. Let him know his lie has been exposed. At 11:30, the procession left for the church. Jacob rode with his parents in his father's car. They were silent the entire way. Dorothy tried to strike up a conversation, but neither her husband nor her son responded. The tension in the car was palpable. St. Paul's Church was decorated with white roses and lilies. Emily was already there, wearing a white dress and a veil. She looked like a real bride. Only her eyes betrayed her inner tension. Pastor Williams, a good-natured gray-haired man who had baptized Jacob, smiled at the young couple. "Are you ready for the most important day of your lives?" Jacob and Emily nodded without looking at each other. The ceremony began at noon. Guests filled the pews, the organ played, and the pastor read prayers. Everything was beautiful and solemn, as it should be at a wedding. But to those who knew the truth, The beauty seemed like a mockery. "Dear brothers and sisters," the pastor began, "we are gathered here to join Jacob Parker and Emily Cole in holy matrimony. Marriage is a divine institution, a union between a man and a woman blessed by the Lord." Frank sat in the front row and listened to the familiar words. A union between a man and a woman. His son was insulting those words with his presence here. "If anyone objects to this marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace," said the pastor. Silence fell over the church. Jacob glanced furtively at his father. Frank was looking straight at him, and there was something frightening in his eyes. The ceremony continued. The young couple exchanged rings and took their vows. Jacob's voice trembled as he said, "I promise to love you and be faithful to you." Emily squeezed his hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, I now pronounce you man and wife," the pastor said solemnly. "You may kiss the bride." Jacob leaned toward Emily and lightly touched her cheek with his lips. The guests applauded, music played, but there was no joy in the air. After the ceremony, everyone went back to the Parkers' house, where tables were set up in the yard. Dorothy and her assistants served refreshments, and the guests congratulated the newlyweds and made toasts. Jacob and Emily sat at the head table, pretending to be happy. "To the newlyweds," Uncle Dave proclaimed, raising his glass. "To a long and happy life." "To the continuation of the Parker family," someone from the guests added. Frank raised his glass but did not drink. He kept looking at his son, who was carefully avoiding his gaze. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the dancing began. Jacob and Emily performed their first dance to Etta James's "At Last." They moved mechanically, like puppets, without the slightest hint of romance. The guests were touched, taking pictures on their phones, oblivious to the fakery. Frank stood at the edge of the dance floor and watched. His son was dancing with a woman who had agreed to this lie. They were deceiving all these good people who had come to share their joy. After the first dance, other couples joined the newlyweds. Dorothy danced with Uncle Dave, and elderly neighbors twirled to the slow melody. The atmosphere became more and more relaxed. That's when Frank decided to act. He walked up to the DJ who was playing the music and asked for the microphone. "Can I say a few words?" The music stopped. The guests turned to Frank, expecting the usual fatherly speech. "Dear friends," Frank began, holding the microphone. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "Thank you for coming to share this special day with us." Jacob sensed that something was wrong. There was an intonation in his father's voice that he couldn't recognize. "I'd like to tell you something about my son," Frank continued, "about the kind of person he really is." Dorothy frowned. This didn't sound like a typical father's speech. "You see, I've been proud of Jacob my whole life. I thought I had raised a real man, a worthy successor to our family name. But yesterday I learned the truth." Jacob turned pale. "Dad, don't." "Don't what? Don't tell the truth?" Frank looked at his son with cold fury. "My son is a pervert. He's gay. This wedding is a lie, a deception, a mockery of all of you." A whisper of horror rose from the crowd of guests. Some gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief. "Frank, stop!" Dorothy cried, but her husband didn't listen. "You came here to celebrate the sacred sacrament of marriage, and he's put on a show for you. He's defiling our home, our faith, our name." Jacob stood up from his chair. "Dad, please don't do this." "Don't do what? Don't defend the family honor?" Frank reached under his jacket and pulled out a gun. The guests screamed and some ran for the exit. "Frank, put the gun down!" Sheriff Tom shouted, taking a step forward. "Stay where you are, Tom. This is a family matter." Emily grabbed Jacob's arm. "Run," she whispered. But Jacob stood frozen, staring at his father. "Dad, I'm your son. You can't." "My son is dead," Frank said, raising his gun. "And you're just a mistake that needs to be corrected." The shot rang out like thunder on a clear day. Jacob clutched his chest and fell to the ground. Blood spread across his white shirt, turning it into a crimson flower. "Jacob!" Dorothy screamed and rushed to her son. Chaos. Screams. People ran in all directions, hid behind tables, called emergency services. Emily knelt next to Jacob, pressing her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Hang in there, Jake! Hang in there!" But Jacob couldn't hear her anymore. He was looking up at the sky, and the life slowly drained from his eyes. Frank stood over his son's body, holding the smoking gun. There was no emotion on his face, no regret, no anger, no grief, only emptiness. "Frank, drop the gun!" Tom shouted, but didn't dare to come closer. Frank looked at his friend, then at his wife, who was sobbing over her son's body, then at the guests, who were looking at him in horror. "I did what I had to do," he said calmly. Then he turned and walked toward the house. The guests parted before him like waves. "Stop!" Tom shouted, drawing his service weapon. But Frank had already disappeared into the house. Tom heard the door slam, then the sound of an engine starting. Frank started his truck and drove out through the backyard, breaking the fence. By the time the ambulance and police arrived, Frank Parker was long gone, and lying on the grass in the yard was his dead son in his wedding suit, his blood mixing with the petals of white roses. Dorothy was still holding Jacob's head on her lap, rocking back and forth and whispering prayers. Emily sat next to her, her white dress covered in blood, her eyes staring into space. The wedding was over. The hunt had begun. For the first 48 hours after the tragedy, the town of Rosewood was in shock. Police cordons blocked all major roads, helicopters patrolled the area, and FBI agents arrived from the state capitol to lead the search. Frank Parker seemed to have vanished into thin air. Dorothy hadn't left the hospital chapel since the doctors officially pronounced Jacob dead. She sat in the front row of pews, clutching her son's blood-stained wedding tie, and prayed. Father McGregor tried to comfort her, but she couldn't hear him. "Mrs. Parker, you need to eat something," he said gently. "Jacob wouldn't want you to torture yourself like this." "He was a good boy," Dorothy whispered, rocking back and forth. "Kind, smart. Why couldn't Frank just talk to him? Why?" Emily Cole spent those 2 days in a psychiatric ward. The doctors diagnosed her with acute stress disorder. She couldn't stop seeing the moment of the shot, hearing the sound of Jacob's body falling. Sedatives helped little. "I had to do something," she repeated to the police psychologist. "I knew Frank had found out the truth. I should have called off the wedding, taken Jake away." "Emily, you couldn't have foreseen this. No one could have." But she continued to blame herself. In her purse were 2 wedding rings, hers and Jacob's. She couldn't bring herself to take them off. Sheriff Tom Miller hadn't slept for 3 days straight. Frank's truck had been found abandoned at the state line, 50 miles from Rosewood. The tracks led into the woods, but then disappeared. Frank knew these places like the back of his hand. He had hunted here with his father as a child. And during his leave from the army, he had come here alone to deal with his war nightmares. "He's no amateur," Tom told the FBI agents. "Frank fought in 2 wars. He knows how to survive in the wilderness. He can survive in the woods for weeks." But on the 3rd day of the search, something unexpected happened. Frank contacted the authorities himself. He called the station around midnight. Tom recognized his old friend's voice immediately. "Frank, where the hell are you?" "Hi, Tom. I wanted to talk to you. You have to turn yourself in. We'll get you help, find you a good lawyer." "No, Tom, I'm not giving up. But I want you to understand, I'm not crazy. I knew what I was doing." "Frank, you killed your own son." "I killed a pervert who insulted my son's memory." Frank's voice was calm, which was the most frightening thing of all. "My real son died when I learned the truth." "My God, Frank Jacob loved you. He was scared, trying to protect you from pain. He lied to me his whole life. He was going to deceive a good girl, desecrate the sacred institution of marriage. What would you have done in my place?" Tom closed his eyes. "I would have tried to understand. Talked, found a compromise. A compromise with sin? You've changed too, Tom. This world is driving everyone mad." The connection was lost. That was the last time anyone heard Frank Parker's voice. On the 4th day, hunters found his body 20 miles from where the truck had been abandoned. Frank was sitting with his back against an old oak tree, a gun in his hand. Next to him was a note written on a piece of notebook paper. "I couldn't live knowing that my son was a pervert. I couldn't look people in the eye who would pity me. Dorothy, I'm sorry. You were a good wife. The insurance papers and my will are in my army box. Sell the house, leave this town. Start a new life. Forget us both. Frank. The news of Frank's suicide shocked Rosewood as much as Jacob's murder. Dorothy learned about it from Tom, who came to her house with a family psychologist. No, she shook her head. It's not true. Frank couldn't have done that. He's a strong man, he wouldn't. But when she was shown the note, written in familiar handwriting, she realized that she had lost both her husband and her son in 4 days. The funerals took place a week later. Jacob and Frank were buried on the same day, but in different cemeteries. Dorothy insisted on this. She couldn't bear the thought of them lying next to each other. Hundreds of people attended Jacob's funeral. His fellow teachers, students, Emily's friends, neighbors. Many townspeople who had never known the young teacher came to express their support for the family and protest against what had happened. Jacob Parker was a good man, said Pastor Williams at the funeral. He dedicated his life to educating children, helping them find their way in this complicated world. What happened to him is a tragedy that must never be repeated. Emily stood next to the coffin in a black dress. She was still wearing her wedding ring. Now she was the widow of a man she had married out of compassion. Frank's funeral was very different. About 30 people attended, a few fellow soldiers, old neighbors, shop owners who knew him through business. Tom Miller stood at the coffin in full dress uniform, paying his last respects to the man who had once saved his life in Iraq. The war changed him, he told reporters after the ceremony. Frank never fully returned from Iraq. PTSD, old injuries, a conservative upbringing, it all created a toxic mix. But that doesn't excuse what he did. Dorothy didn't attend her husband's funeral. She sat at home packing her belongings. The house where she had lived for 30 years now felt like a mausoleum. Every corner reminded her of the tragedy. The Parker family's story spread across the country. Journalists besieged Rosewood, filming reports and interviewing witnesses. Liberal publications wrote about the victims of homophobia, conservative ones about the crisis of family values. No one tried to understand the true essence of the tragedy. Mark Dennis arrived in Rosewood 2 weeks after the funeral. He stood at Jacob's grave for a long time, holding a bouquet of white roses in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have come sooner. I should have taken you away from this place." Emily found him there that evening. They didn't speak, just stood there, two people who loved Jacob in different ways, but sincerely. "He talked about you," Emily finally said. "You were the only one he could be himself with. And you were his protection. Thank you for that." They never saw each other again, but every year on the anniversary of Jacob's death, 2 bouquets of white roses appeared on his grave. Dorothy sold the house a month later and moved to California to be with her sister. Before she left, she met Emily one last time. "I knew," she said quietly. "Deep down, I always knew something was wrong with Jacob. A mother's heart knows, but I was afraid to admit it to myself. You loved him. That's what matters." "I did, and if I could turn back time, I would hug him and tell him that I loved him just the way he was, no matter what." Emily also left Rosewood. She transferred to a hospital in another city, changed her last name, and started a new life. But every wedding anniversary, she took a vacation and spent the day alone, remembering the man who had been her friend and husband for one day. The Parker house stood empty for 6 months. Then a young family from another state bought it. They knew nothing of the tragedy that had occurred there. The new owners demolished the wedding arch that Frank had once lovingly built and built a playground in its place. The Parker Sons gun shop closed its doors for good. Tom Miller bought the license and the guns so that they wouldn't fall into someone else's hands. The building was turned into a coffee shop. A year passed, and Rosewood gradually forgot about the Parker family tragedy. New scandals and new problems occupied the minds of the townspeople. Only at the school where Jacob worked was a memorial plaque hung. Jacob Parker, teacher who helped children find themselves. His former students sometimes brought flowers to the plaque. They remembered Mr. Parker as a kind man who never judged them for being different. The Parker family's story became a warning to some and a confirmation of old prejudices for others. But for those who knew Jacob personally, it was a reminder that love and acceptance are more important than any traditions or beliefs. The Rosewood archives contain a video recording of that ill-fated wedding. One of the guests filmed the ceremony on their phone and didn't turn it off even during the tragedy. The recording shows Jacob and Emily dancing their first and last dance, smiling at the guests, trying to look happy. The last frames show the moment when Frank takes the microphone. You can see Jacob's face change when he realizes what his father is about to say. You can see the horror in Emily's eyes. You can see the lives of several people being destroyed in a matter of minutes. This recording is kept in the police archives as evidence in a closed case. No one will ever see it again, but it exists as a silent witness to the fact that hatred can destroy even the strongest family ties, and that the fear of being oneself can cost a person their life.